My name is Jim Hollifield. I'm a professor here and the director of the Tower Center. I want to welcome you to this symposium on new immigration trends, especially focused on the Central American kids. This program is a joint program with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And I'm happy to say that the Tower Center here at SMU has had a very long-standing partnership with the Wilson Center, which grows stronger every day and every week. We are on a very tight time schedule today because later this evening, the Woodrow Wilson Center will be honoring Richard Fisher, the president of the Dallas Fed, and Mr. Ullman, who is the president and CEO of JCPenney, with their very prestigious public service award. In addition to the Wilson Center, we also have a great relationship with the Dallas Fed. We have done many programs with them. The president has honored us, take some time to come out here to say a few welcoming remarks. He has been up against the wall for a couple of days here, running a very big international conference celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Federal Reserve System by President Woodrow Wilson, I might add, so this comes very much full circle. So Richard has had Paul Volcker, the Fed chair, with him for the past 2 or 3 days, and he told me he had to stay up very late last night. I don't know if the Chairman Volcker kept you up till 3 in the morning. But would you all please join me in welcoming to the podium Richard Fisher, the President and CEO of the Dallas Fed.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank Jim, who is a very good friend, and of course the Wilson Center, which has always been a great establishment, and Jane Harmon, who's here, who runs it, a former 9-term member of Congress, and much happier being at the Wilson Center, I think, than you could ever be. Yes, see, you could ever be in Congress. So it's an honor for me to basically welcome you to this joint SMU Tower Center Wilson Center event. This topic is timely, it's important, it's very dear to my heart, and the reason is because I am the son of immigrants. In fact, you might say I'm the son of multiple immigrants, because when my father arrived here in 1939 because of his past, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later tonight at this dinner, they wouldn't let him in. My mother was allowed in, my father was not, and so he got on a Greyhound bus and ended up in Tijuana, Mexico. And it took him 8 years. We have a beautiful document in my office. You paid a head tax under the Act of 1917 of $8 when you crossed back and forth to the border. And you filled out a document. And I have copies of those documents in my office. My favorite is it would show, did you come first class, second class, or in steerage? But it says with my father, after he paid his $8 head tax, he traveled on foot. But they checked the first class box, so we said, you must have been wearing a hell of a pair of shoes when you, as what we called an anglo mojado, as a white wetback coming across the border. And then, of course, when he got here, he immediately left in order to make money, went to Shanghai, got out the second last ship before Mao's forces took over the port. It was the SS President Wilson, by the way. And my mother was pregnant with me. So I was manufactured in China, like everything else. Anyway, I'm no immigration expert. You're going to hear from my brilliant vice president and uber brilliant economist, Orrenius. But I do want to make some comments on immigration. There are a number of ways in which immigration affects what a central bank thinks about and does. As you know, we formulate monetary policy, among other things, based on the health of labor markets. And labor markets figure very prominently in our discussions. We just finished a Federal Open Market Committee meeting where we set interest rates and policy for our country, and as it turns out, because of our role as a central bank for the world. And we know that migration is very important to healthy labor markets. Economists like to say that healthy labor markets are characterized by the efficient allocation of workers across jobs. Too many workers chasing too few jobs results in high unemployment and, of course, too few available workers to fill what the firms wish for results in unemployment that is too low. It's important also to have the right person for the right job. This boosts productivity, it minimizes turnover, and more importantly, it makes for happier workers. It's important that markets are flexible enough to direct workers to the economic opportunities that exist. Flexible markets also include a responsive labor supply, namely that workers respond to opportunities as they arise. You know this because many of you are students and others are immigrants themselves. Taking the right job may imply moving to another city or even another state or even another country. And for others, it may require retooling or going back to a great school like SMU. In recent years, the tremendous growth we've experienced in our region here in Texas, and I will bend your ear, President Harmon, endlessly tonight as my dinner partner in terms of what we've been able to do here in Texas. But what it's meant is we've relied on an inflow of workers from other states and other countries to sustain our pace of growth. We've been especially prolific in creating jobs here in Texas since the Great Recession waylaid the world starting in 2007. Today, employment in Texas is 8.9% above its pre-recession peak. The nation as a whole is just 0.6% above that peak. U.S. job creation has been so concentrated in Texas that if you take Texas out of the nation, I'm speaking statistically, not the way the governor would like to do it, but if you take the nation's Texas out of the nation statistically, you'll see the rest of the United States still has not caught up to its pre-recession employment levels. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, payroll employment data, Texas has created 1.1 million jobs since December of 2007. The rest of our country, unfortunately, has lost 282,000 jobs. The Texas growth premium accelerated in the recovery from the Great Recession, but it isn't new by any means. For over 2 decades, this state has outgrown the rest of the United States in job creation by more than a factor of 2 to 1. If we compare this to other large states, the statistics are even more compelling. Now let's take New York, for example. And remember, New York is where the Statue of Liberty is and where freedom's beacon stands. Over 24 years since 1990, only 9 net new jobs for every 100 that existed there 24 years ago have been created. Whereas in Texas, 66 net new jobs have been created for every 100 that existed in our state in 1990. Now, sustaining this rapid rate of growth requires more workers than Texas can supply on its own. The state-level migration statistics bear this out. Texas has long been a top destination for international immigration. And since 2006, it's been the top destination for domestic migrants in the country. About a quarter of our migrants come to Texas from California. An additional 15% or so come from Florida and New York. Over the last 7 years, net migration to Texas has averaged over 215,000 people per year, with about 60% coming from states within the United States, but with 40% coming from other countries. Recently, our research that we've done at the Research Center at the Dallas Fed, it also suggests that we're not just creating jobs, we're creating good jobs. We have been creating jobs in every wage quartile for the last 13 years. And here's the sad part about our country. In the 2 middle-income quartiles, we've seen net job destruction over the last 13 years, again, if you take Texas statistically out of the United States. So the recent data shows that wage growth in Texas over the last year is running about 2 times the pace of the wage growth of the rest of the country. The point is, people come here to work. And the point is that immigration, whether it's internal or coming from abroad to fill skill sets that are needed for a healthy economy, is vital to our success. You're going to hear from Pia and from the other panelists later, but I just wanted to say with these introductory remarks, I'm going to turn the program back to you. I can conclude that there is no mystery why people want to come to this great country and to this great state. thank you very much for having me here, and I wish you luck during the conference. And Madam President, I look forward to having dinner with you tonight. Thank you very much.
Richard, thanks. Thanks for those remarks. Okay, I want to ask our guest from Washington, D.C., the Honorable Jane Harman, who was for many years in the U.S. Congress and has now taken the position of President of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to ask her to come up and make just a few comments, introductory remarks, and then we'll bring the panel up and get started here. So, Jane, can you make it up there? There we go.
Well, hi, everybody. We're now going to have a law school exam. I'm actually a recovering lawyer. My late husband used to say that I practiced law a long time, but I never got it right. And now I'm a recovering politician on top of that, so go figure. But I'm happy to follow Richard's remarks and to welcome you to this joint activity between the Wilson Center and the Tower Center. I remember John Tower well. I was an aide in the United States Senate when he was a senator. And that was a time, imagine, most of you weren't born, or some of you weren't, when the Congress actually functioned. We don't have time to go into the dismal decline today, but when people ask me if I miss the Congress, I say, is that a joke question? At any rate, this is a very important and serious subject, and the Wilson Center has worked on it for years and years and years. We're going to show off our Executive Vice President, Andrew Selee, who's one of the panelists here, and who founded our Mexico Institute, which has done amazing work on this topic. And just recently, as the border crisis hit the airwaves, it obviously was felt more intensely here than in Washington, D.C., but it wasn't, I doubt, covered more luridly here than it was in Washington, D.C. But at any rate, the Wilson Center, which is a nonpartisan institution, and the living memorial to President Wilson, the only PhD president we've ever had. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of his presidency, hosted a panel with the 3 foreign ministers from the countries affected in Central America. It was a fabulously well attended. We produced papers, and they helped to frame, let's just imagine, a serious conversation in Congress and throughout Washington on what the actionable ideas are for improving policy. And that's the kind of thing we do. I'm sure Andrew will discuss this, but to me, I have to pinch myself. I call the place an intellectual candy store. You can learn as much as you want, and you don't get fat. And it matters in Washington to have a place like that, free from spin, where everybody wants to come. A very well-known Republican senator, who shall remain nameless because he doesn't behave this way on the airwaves, but he tells me privately he loves to come to the Wilson Center because it is a safe political space. And that's what we offer, is a safe political space. And on this topic, again, we have over many, many years studied border issues, migration issues, immigration issues, and policy issues affecting not just our country, but Central and Latin America and Canada as well. So welcome to everybody. Jim and the panelists, I think, will do something very exciting here, which is, again, to discuss this topic in a factual way, free from spin. I love showing off the Wilson Center, so you're going to be really, really impressed by Andrew Selee. Welcome.
Thank you, Jane. Let's give her a hand. Well, this is a subject that's always full of emotion, fills the passions, but we're going to give you what I think will be a fairly dispassionate analysis. And I now want to ask all of our panelists if they would just come up to the podium, please. Since much of this is being filmed, we're sort of tied to microphones and podiums, so with our designated places to sit. But what I think I will do is just very quickly introduce the panel and the panelists to you so we can jump right in. And then we're going to have some time for questions once they finish. But when we were thinking about putting this panel together, we were thinking about three topics related to immigration. The first one has to do with the current trends in immigration. And these are the numbers, the flows, what's happening in the latest immigration numbers. And the person who is going to present that is my colleague, Dr. Pia Orrenius, who's a senior fellow here in the Tower Center. And as Richard Fisher mentioned, she is vice president for regional economies here at the Dallas Fed. I won't go into all of Pia's publications. I'm not going to read the bios. I think you can find those online. But I will say that Pia handed to me yesterday this latest report on the Texas economy, and I think before she even got a copy of it, Rick Perry had it waving it around and saying, look at Texas and what we've accomplished here. A 4.6% growth rate in Dallas-Fort Worth, which for any of you who know about economics, you know that that's a pretty impressive growth rate. And I think Pia told me that she got to write something she's never written before in her life, which is this growth rate cannot be sustained. So that's how good Dallas-Fort Worth is doing. We're going to follow Pia's overview of the trends with a presentation which will take us right down to the human level on the border, and this will be presented by our friend and the Mexico bureau chief for the Dallas Morning News, who wrote a very provocative book that many of you have read called Midnight in Mexico. I noticed that he's been a fellow at almost every prominent institution on the East Coast, including the Wilson Center and Columbia University. One of the most incredibly distinguished journalists writing about Mexico, and truly just a gem working here at the Dallas Morning News. And he's going to tell us about the situation at the border and what's happening with the people there and looking at the humanitarian side of this. The final panelists, and they're just going to come to the podium after I finish this introduction, each of them. The final panelist is Andrew Selee. I've known Andrew for a number of years, and as Jane Harmon mentioned, he is one of the leading authorities in the United States on Mexico and U.S.-Mexico. I learned when I was in Washington recently that we share a background at the U.S.-Mexico Center at the University of California in San Diego. Andrew has written multiple books about Mexico and U.S.-Mexico. I doubt if there's a gringo around who knows more about Mexico than Andrew does. And he's going to tell us about the policy situation in Washington. So we're going to wind up with a discussion about policy. And when it's finished, Andrew will show us the path forward for immigration reform, right, Andrew? No, he's also been editorializing a lot about the Central American kids. So would you all join me now in welcoming to the podium my great friend and colleague, Dr. Pia Orrenius.
Thank you, Jim, for the warm welcome. I'm also very pleased to be here, very thankful to be included to discuss the new immigration patterns that we're seeing and the significance of them for policy. As Jim mentioned, I was sort of asked to give you the numbers, which I guess comes naturally to me, probably too many numbers. But so I sat down to think, what can we learn from recent trends? And I think what you'll notice is when we look at the numbers, well, there's more than one trend. So I divide them into less recent and more recent. So we can really look at this from the two perspectives. And so what's trending now? Well, the less recent trend, which is still ongoing, is the decline in unauthorized immigration from Mexico. And as we were observing this trend ongoing now for many years, we've attributed it to a weak U.S. economy, obviously, two recessions in the 2000s, and the Great Recession being the worst of those two, and tougher immigration policies which have come at the same time. Now, the more recent trend is very different. It's a rise in Central American migration, and it's the new child migration. And it comes at the same time that, in contrast to the earlier trends, which came with tougher immigration policies, this rise in Central American migration is coming on the heels of some easing of policy, which I'm not going to discuss in detail because Andrew Selee is going to touch on the policy. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention because obviously people are noting the correlation between the rise in Central American immigration and the easing of some of the policies regarding unauthorized immigrants, such as prosecutorial discretion in removal proceedings, the passing of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which has actually allowed about 550,000 Dreamers to remain in the United States and receive work permits. And then there's this provision where the reentry bars were recently waived in some cases of unauthorized immigrants who are adjusting status. Let's look first at what has been this amazing change on the border, and which stems really back to 2000. If we look at Border Patrol apprehensions of migrants, they're down 75% from 2000, as you can see in this chart. This is almost entirely due to declining apprehensions of migrants from Mexico. So this is a Mexican phenomenon. And as you can see here, and it's really pervasive and very distinct from the patterns we'll see in migration from other countries. As a result, we've seen a decline in the Mexican unauthorized population, and here you can see on the left side is the numbers for the Mexican unauthorized population from the Pew Research Center, and you can see it's declined from its peak of about 7 million in the late 2000s to about 6 million today, so about a decline of a million people. Whereas the rest of the unauthorized population, so that on the other side, on the right side of this chart, you can see that non-Mexicans who are among the unauthorized population, that population has continued to rise. So again, the factors behind the decline in Mexican migration, we've been noting 2 jobless recoveries over the last decade or so, 2 recessions and 2 jobless recoveries, and housing market collapse, obviously. Increased enforcement, so lots and lots of enforcement on the border, more volume of enforcement and stricter enforcement, like zero tolerance policies that actually put migrants, even apprehended for the first time, puts them in jail. And then also tougher interior policies, which really have rubbed people the wrong way, like secure communities, and electronic verification of your ability to work legally in the United States. And electronic verification, it might surprise you to know, is some states have passed it, so it's mandatory for all workers and all employers to check the status of their workers. But even states like Texas, where we don't have mandatory E-Verify, lots and lots of corporations are implementing it. And so it's still impacting workers. And then changing conditions in Mexico, of course. So Mexico has macroeconomic stability, which was a rarity before 1990 or before recent times. And they're realizing slow but steady growth. They've also had slowing population growth and an improved safety net. So lots of improvements in Mexico. You just have to dig under the surface sometimes to see them. Here's just Border Patrol staffing I just wanted to show you. It's up 132% from 2000 in terms of the number of agents. So we're running about 21,000 Border Patrol agents on the southwest border currently. The other policy we've had in conjunction with secure communities and other interior policies targeting unauthorized immigrants is record removals or deportations by the Department of Homeland Security, as you can see in this chart, which have been reaching, in recent years, 350,000, 400,000 people removed per year. Okay, so that's the sort of the old trend, and here's the new trend. Well, you saw the apprehensions of Mexican migrants was down, down, down over time, and here is the one of non-Mexican migrants. And so really oddly shaped. We had a peak in 2005, and that was actually Brazilians. Before the, yeah, it's surprising, but that's true. Octavio, you remember, you know all about visas. When Mexico didn't require Brazilians to have a visa, they went to Mexico and then crossed the border into the United States. But now it's not Brazilians. Now it's overwhelmingly Central Americans. So you can see the spike in 2012 and 2013 with the increase in Central American migration. And so much of this increases of apprehensions of unaccompanied children. So they're up 170% since 2012, as you can see in this chart. So year to date, fiscal year to date, as the data is kept by fiscal year, so through August 2014, we're running almost 70,000 children, unaccompanied children that have been apprehended on the border. So many of those unaccompanied minors. So what are the factors really behind the increase in Central American migration? Well, if you do the laundry list, there's obviously Central American instability, and I'll show you a couple charts on economic growth, and we'll look at violence in those countries. And then, of course, there is the U.S. policy piece. There has been some easing of certain policies, as I showed you in the earlier slide. And then there is the 2008 law, which basically states that if you're a minor from a country that's not contiguous to the United States, the government will try to reunite you with your family members here, if possible, and then you can remain until your court date, which, with the current backlogs in the immigration system, can be many years. So I would also offer up another factor, which I think is compelling. Innovative smugglers that have basically, I would argue, taken advantage of the loopholes in policy and to make a profit and bring these children here. This is economic growth in Central America, so it's not true that the economies, at least if you measure by GDP, has been doing worse over time. Economic growth since about 2010 in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador has been steady, around 3% in those countries. So really the economic situation is not getting worse. In terms of the violence situation, we see homicide rates are flat to down in El Salvador and Guatemala, but they are up substantially in Honduras. So we do see that violence in Honduras is going to be a factor, and I'll let Alfredo talk about this. He probably knows more about it than I do. So to conclude, really, what you can see is that unauthorized immigration from Mexico is declining both in volume and its share of total unauthorized immigration, that Central American immigration is on the rise, that home country conditions are only part of the story, and that we have to look at U.S. policy because it's going to matter. We also need to consider these smugglers, really, these middlemen are exploiting policy loopholes for profit, I would argue, because if you think about it, bringing an unaccompanied minor to the United States is a huge profit opportunity for the smuggler, who actually then doesn't even have to evade Border Patrol, just turns drops the child at the border, the child just turns himself or herself into the Border Patrol, doesn't have to evade Border Patrol, and then the smuggler can go back to Central America and pick up more children. So I think that's been a big part of the story that maybe other people haven't talked so much about. But the unfortunate consequences are many here. I mean, first of all, these are dangerous journeys, disrupted lives for these children. Many of them will eventually get deported. It may take years, but probably the immigration lawyers in this room would know this better than I. But my sense is a large chunk of them will end up having to go back. And then the other tragedy of the situation is that it's eroded public support for comprehensive immigration reform. So at the same time, you know, we have 11 million, we have 12 million unauthorized, or between 11 and 12 million unauthorized immigrants here in the U.S. who, you know, have been hoping and dreaming about immigration reform, and I think these latest trends have just put that dream further out of reach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pia. And now let's hear from Alfredo Corchado.
Okay. Thank you very much. I also want to thank SMU for the invitation and Jim for the nice remarks. And thank the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was not only helped by the Woodrow Wilson Center as I wrote Midnight in Mexico, but when I went to Honduras, in particular, Eric Olson was incredibly helpful in helping me not just prepare for the trip, but also find the right people on the ground to get a real perspective. Can we start with the... This is also the first time I do a PowerPoint. And I thought what I do is we at the Dallas Morning News, we spent much of the summer trying to investigate, get to the bottom, or not the bottom, but just try to understand more of the root causes of immigration from Honduras and Central America. I was accompanied by my colleague Angela Cocherga, who was at one point part of BELO and is now part of Gannett. We try to do stories together for safety reasons. We also, and I hope we're off the record, but we're also a couple. But we try to work together as much as we can, especially in dangerous areas like whether it's Nuevo Laredo, Ciudad Juarez, in this case in Honduras. So what I want to do is show you some of the stories, talk kind of the backdrop to the stories, and then we'll do the Q&A later. But I spent much of the summer telling the story of young Central Americans risking everything to reach this country. I accompany reporters to San Pedro Sula and the surrounding areas. San Pedro, because it has the highest crime rate. And witness a country where the young have given up hope, where a place where childhood ends early, a place so dangerous that we have to be escorted by either military or by local community organizers to get into certain communities like Chamelecon, which is controlled by two rival groups, El 13, Mara Salvatrucha 13 en Calle 18, or by local or community organizers. And then, why don't we show that story first? So I'll show you the story, and then we spent the latter part of the summer traveling the route of La Bestia throughout Mexico. So this is the story that Angela did, but we really worked on it together. First PowerPoint might be the last one. There you go. We spent the week in San Pedro Sula, and one of the interesting things that we talked about was we had covered Juarez, we had covered Nuevo Laredo, and we kept joking we were in San Pedro Sula that we really miss Mexico because of how dangerous it was. And it's kind of an interesting place because you get there and suddenly you see all the ¿Se pudo? Not gonna happen. We have to have the advertising.
You don't stop. That's true.
That's okay.
Oh, great. This is not San Pedro Sula, by the way.
No, but it does kind of look like San Pedro Sula because you have this. Here we go.
Honduran military police lead the way on a drive through territory torn apart by gang warfare. This is Chamelecon, ground zero in the fight to take back neighborhoods controlled by violent gangs. The strategy: restore security and spruce up an area that has become a virtual ghost town.
Está más o menos abandonada.
Sí, está como abandonada.
Volunteers with the Mennonite Church clear weeds surrounding abandoned homes, all under the watchful eye of military police.
¿Se puede observar usted?
Our guide is a captain in the new police force, created this year to restore law and order.
Y que ellos puedan habitar en sus viviendas tranquilamente.
The goal, he says, is for people to live peacefully in their own homes.
We're in what's known as a casa loca, or crazy house. This home used to belong to a family. Now you see it looks like it's almost been demolished. There's rubble all over the floor. Everything's been torn off the walls. We're in the kitchen. So what happened here? Families were forced to flee from this area. Whoever lived here was given 2 hours to get out by gang members. They then took over the property and used it for criminal activity.
Some flee not just their neighborhoods, but their country. Authorities say MS-13 and the Mara Salvatrucha are a major reason for the mass migration of kids. The choice: stay and join the gangs or escape to the U.S. The military police arrived here in May. Slowly, gang graffiti is being replaced by messages of peace. But it's just a beginning. Real progress, Hondurans say, is when people feel it's safe enough to come home.
Okay, so we stop.
Only Sears brings you more selection.
Okay. So the second part of the journey was to start in Tenosique, Tabasco, and follow the beast, the train, up north. My idea was to try to get on the train and head up to Veracruz and just kind of interview people, something that many reporters have done in the past. But what was interesting was that most people were stuck. The Central Americans were stuck. They were either in shelters or on streets trying to raise money. There was a lot of Mexican authorities who suddenly were trying to do their jobs, like this guy here in Tenosique, and checking people. You see a lot of the buses were empty. This guy, for example, had walked, they had spent a week walking almost 200 miles. This guy, Jaime Eduardo, said, we need more than God to help us in our journey. I need a machete, so he carried a 20-inch machete with him. This is really too fast. So let me just try to tell the story. One thing that Chris Arcos, who was the former ambassador in Honduras, told me a while back was, if you want to be a correspondent and you want to understand these two countries, understand one lesson. And that's that Americans are very dishonest about their dishonesty, and Mexicans are very honest about their dishonesty. So one of the things that I learned during this trip was suddenly you saw the Mexicans take the immigration thing very seriously. And in some parts, I mean, what's happening today is very interesting. The beast, for example, is now being controlled very closely by Mexican authorities. There's also, they just announced last month, for example, that they're going to they're going to make the beast, a train, go faster so that people won't get on. The train is really the most popular place for people without documents, people without money to try to get to the United States. So they're really, there's a lot of vigilance on the trains. And the result is, we just did a story a couple of weeks ago, the result is you have the cartels in Mexico are much more focused on illegal immigration or smuggling than they are on smuggling drugs. For example, in the last 3-4 months, I think they made something like $60 million just from Central Americans coming through Mexico into South Texas. That money is mostly generated in the Reynosa, McAllen area. And I'll leave it at that, and then we'll get to the questions.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. Okay, I would now like to ask Andrew Selee to go to the podium and talk to us about policy.
Well, Alfredo and Pia are very hard acts to follow here, but I will try and do my best to touch on some of the policy issues, and I may repeat a couple of things that they've said already as well. Let me start by thanking Jim Hollifield for the opportunity to work together on this. We've had a very productive relationship with Jim and the Tower Center, and we're looking forward to doing many more things together, both in Dallas and in Washington, D.C. And I should also call out one of the things the Wilson Center does. Jane talked about us being a trusted space for serious policy discussions. One of the things we do also on the research side is we host a number of scholars who come in on areas that we work on. And actually looking around here, there's at least three people that have been scholars at the Wilson Center. Alfredo is one who wrote part of his book, Midnight in Mexico, which is out in Penguin. I recommend it to you all. Fabulous book. Couldn't put it down when I read it. Wrote part of it there. Neil Foley, who is a professor at SMU, who just his book Mexicans in the Making of America, just out from Harvard University Press, and Jesus Velasco, who his book on neoconservatives and American foreign policy, which was published by the Wilson Center Press and Johns Hopkins. So great to have all of you here. Good to see Chris Arcos, already mentioned, Ambassador Chris Arcos, and Octavio Tripp, old friend I haven't seen for a while, Mexico's Consul General here in Dallas as well. So let me say a little bit on. I want to make 2 points today. I mean, one is, and they're actually points that Pia has already made, but they bear repeating. One is that the paradigm that we've all thought about on migration in the United States, what is the big issue on immigration in the United States, has been about unauthorized immigration from Mexico to the United States. That paradigm is actually changing. That paradigm is changing, and we need to replace it with a new paradigm, because Mexican immigration, unauthorized Mexican immigration in the United States, is unlikely to be a major feature of our future. It was actually not a huge feature. There's always been Mexican immigration, and there will always be Mexican immigration, authorized and unauthorized. There's lots of reasons, a 4-to-1 difference in wage rates between the two countries. It will continue. But the high levels of Mexican unauthorized immigration to the United States that we saw for the past 25 years are unlikely to happen again. And I'll say something about why that is, repeating a little bit what Pia said. So we need to actually begin thinking differently about immigration in the United States. We have a lot of immigration issues. There will be issues like the Central American migrants, like the Brazilians, some issues with Asia, some issues with the Middle East that will pop up. We will continuously have challenges around unauthorized immigration to the United States, but they're unlikely to be as vast as what we saw in the past 25 years. And what we do have is huge challenges in our legal migration system, immigration system, that we should begin thinking of. So that's the first point. And the second point is we should begin thinking, in the particular case of Central American migration, there are a set of things that we can do fairly quickly. Reasonable people can agree on this. How you actually hammer out the policies will depend on politicians getting together, making some decisions, but that reasonable people could agree on that would actually help deal with both some of the root causes as well as some of the symptoms of what we've been seeing. On the first point, let me say on Mexican migration, Pia has already covered a lot of this, but from the 1980s through 2005, 2006, we did see a huge wave of Mexicans coming across the border without documents, without authorization, illegal immigration, however you wish to term it. Three things have really changed. One is the relative weight of the economies. The U.S. economy has not been great for a while. Despite the great success in Texas, we have not seen that replicated at the same level elsewhere, and congratulations to Richard and Pia and others that have worked on this, but it is, and all of you in the room actually, but it is we're likely to see slow growth here. And when people look at Mexico, and this will come as a surprise to people that, you look at Mexico, and Mexico is not usually thought of as a great economic success story. It grows at 2 or 3% on average. But in fact, when you add this up over 20 years, what you have is that Mexican wages have grown on average about 1/3 in the past 20 years. Now, that's not huge, but that's large enough to make a huge difference. What else has grown is education. Education has grown about 50%, from an average of 6 years of schooling, if you go back to 1994, to 2014, an average of 9 years of schooling. That's actually a huge difference. That's the difference between primary school and secondary school. And if you look at people in the younger generations, they're actually much more likely to have high school and college education, something that was very rare 20 years ago. If you look at healthcare, if you go back 20 years, about half the people in Mexico had a health care policy. Today, a little over 85% of people in Mexico have a health care policy. If you look at average age, the lifespan that people have, it's actually gone up 3 to 4 years in the past 20 years, actually, because of better access to health, among other reasons. So Mexico has changed enormously. It's not one of the spectacular stories of China-like growth, but it is a story of incredible change if you look at a whole generation. And if you compare that to a slowing down in the U.S., I was talking to a man in Zacatecas last summer who had been a migrant. We were walking down the street. I just met him. And I said, would you go back to the United States again? And he said, look, not really. And I said, why? And he said, because, the economy here is here, and the economy in the United States is here. That was actually the most eloquent description I've seen of why people aren't crossing. So that's a big piece, right? Accumulative, it doesn't mean people won't keep crossing, but the large numbers are less likely to happen. Two, as Pia mentioned, enforcement is a huge issue. I mean, the fact that we simply have not only more boots on the ground, but more technology, and technology is a huge piece of this. In terms of the qualitative aspect of enforcement, it's a lot harder to get across the border. It's a lot more expensive to get across the border. And so it raises, as you're looking at your options in the future, things are slightly better in Mexico, they're slightly worse in the U.S., and the cost of getting across is substantially higher, is a huge disincentive for people to come across. And third, and that'll continue to increase over time. I mean, and it's also become much harder. If you get caught, you're much more likely to be deported now. In the past, you were given essentially a voluntary departure. Most of the time now you're actually deported. It's hard to come back again. And third, we haven't talked about this yet, but demography. Mexico is actually at the beginning of the downward trend in the 15 to 30-year-old group. The people who migrate tend to be in their 15 to 30-year-old range. Mexico is actually right at the beginning of a long-term decline. It's a population that's getting older. Mexico's had very effective birth control policies since the 1970s. The average number of children per female, which is how these things are measured, is actually very close to the United States right now. Mexico actually has a very low birth rate, and has had a low birth rate for the past 20 years. And so you're actually seeing fewer people in the age range who would cross the border. Central America is not there. Most Central American countries, El Salvador is a partial exception, are actually on an upward spiral still going upward in terms of demography. You have a lot of people in that age range. And to finish this part off, the U.S. economic crisis served something as what Malcolm Gladwell would call a tipping point. In many ways, these trends are all long-term trends, but a moment where people stopped coming, and for a couple of years, you would call your cousin in Los Angeles and they would say, wait, I don't have a job for you, it's not a good time to cross, wait, in many ways served to cut the cycle of people going. And we have not seen it pick up again since the U.S. economy has picked up. So moving there, so I think that what that tells us, we need to rethink our paradigm on how we think about immigration, which is still dominated in this country by the image of people jumping over the border fence. Second point, on Central Americans. There's several different things going on. Violence, particularly in Honduras, and if you map the areas of violence in Honduras, around San Pedro Sula and the whole northern coast of Honduras, this is the most violent area, and it's where the migrants are coming from. In El Salvador, it partially maps. In Guatemala, it does not map actually very well. The greatest violence is not necessarily where people are leaving. But violence is clearly a huge, huge indicator in Honduras, and Honduras has been on an upswing of violence. It's now the most violent country in the world. Economic instability, not economic collapse, but economic instability, and certainly the perception that people could stay in this country, and as I think Pia called them, the smugglers who were entrepreneurial, who were able to convince people that they would be able to stay in the country, played a huge role. We've seen a policy response already which has been successful in bringing this down. We're down to about a third to a quarter of the number of young people, minors, crossing the border from Central America from what the numbers were in May and June. When this was a front page story in the United States, in May and June, we're about the third to a quarter of the numbers of young people coming across right now. And that's largely because Mexico made it very hard to come through the train that goes across Mexico, which the young people were using, and generally started policing the border much better. They don't actually police the border itself. It's a little further in primarily. A lot of messaging about the fact that it was dangerous to cross. A much quicker deportations, even though they can leave people for a long period of time, they actually sped up the deportations to send a signal that people would not be able to stay in the country, and much better enforcement on the U.S. side as well. These are actually fairly significant gains, and as much as I find myself very sympathetic with many of these Central American youngsters, it is actually much better for them not to start the journey out, right? I mean, these are tough enforcement measures, but it actually makes it so that many of these kids do not start a journey that is very dangerous. And if I can give you apprentices, I actually started out, my first job was working with young people at the U.S.-Mexico border on the Mexican side. And I always remember, every time this story, because I always remember a young man named Henry who was 16 years old from Honduras. I was mostly working with Mexican kids, but this one kid from Honduras who I bonded with because we both hated nopales. If anyone knows what nopales are, they're cactus. Okay, it's kind of a slimy food which is loved in Mexico. We were the two foreigners actually at this home for migrant youth, and so we bonded over the fact that we could not eat nopales. Still can't actually. But Henry was fantastic. He was actually one of the most interesting people I've ever met. But the story of what he went through to get from Honduras to the border, to Tijuana, to Mexicali, and then to Tijuana was absolutely, I won't even go into details, was really terrifying. What these young people go through in terms of violations, systematic violations of their rights as they cross 3 different borders is truly terrifying. So though, our hearts may go out to them, actually enforcing and make it hard for people to start the journey is probably a good thing on this. Secondly, there's a real need to think about those that do have legitimate claims, and this is something the U.S. government is beginning to think about, which is how can you actually adjudicate refugee status, perhaps in Honduras. Honduras is where there really is a close link between the violence and people leaving, to some extent in El Salvador as well, to some extent in Guatemala, but particularly in Honduras, seeing if we can get people on the ground so that we can actually decide this ahead of time. That is something that is complicated, but it is the kind of thing in which the United States could work with Canada, Mexico, Costa Rica, and perhaps take people with legitimate refugee claims. Most would probably come to the United States, but also send some to other places. And doing it before people start the journey would be much more humane, and we do have some precedent on this. And third, there's a real need to do some institution building, and that's something that has to be done by the governments of Central America, but in which the United States and actually Mexico could actually do a great deal together. And I think this is actually one of those opportunities for Mexico and the United States to enter into partnership and see what we can do in terms of policing, intelligence, building small and medium enterprises and micro enterprises. There's a lot of know-how, and frankly, Mexico has a lot of know-how in this, actually more than the United States. The U.S. has a lot of resources. We have a lot of ability to make things happen. But frankly, there's actually more know-how in Mexico, because Mexico's gone through a lot of this in places like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana, where violence has been successfully reduced, in large part by a combination of building institutions and engaging citizen actors. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't say anything about immigration reform. We take no position at the Wilson Center on immigration reform, but I think there's an opportunity, if we assume that what we're dealing with is a new paradigm, that we no longer are going to deal with huge unauthorized flows coming across the U.S.-Mexico border, but we are going to have continual crises, small crises that pop up where there are real, hot spots around the world that people are leaving. This is going to happen forever. Okay, this is part of being a country that has a history of receiving immigrants. People will look, in a country that people see as a beacon of freedom, they will come here when there are crises around the world in a place like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. So, we should be prepared for that. We should not confuse that with the past 25 years. But if we think that going forward, most of the immigration to the United States is going to be legal immigration, and then we're going to be dealing with occasional refugee crises and flows that we did not count on, it makes it much easier to begin to think what kind of immigration laws we want going forward, what kind of enforcement, what kind of visa system, because we haven't changed our visa system in significant ways since the 1960s. The economy's changed, but we haven't really changed our visa system. And what do we then do with the 11 million people that are here without documents, and how do we deal with that? And those are contentious issues that have to be dealt with politically, but it becomes much easier to deal with them if we shift to the new paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you. I know some of you may have to leave, but let's hold on just a second. We have a new paradigm that Andrew has talked about. We have these big shifts in the flows that Pia has talked about. And we have this human catastrophe, really, with the Central American kids trying to make this journey north. So I now want to open it up to questions from the audience, and I know there are going to be a lot of questions, so I may collect. If you could sort of direct your question to one of the panelists, or if it's for all of them, and introduce yourself. Stand up when you speak. I'm first going to call on my colleague, Sandy Thatcher, who is sitting right in the middle here. Sandy? And the microphone is right beside you there. Okay.
Andrew, I would question your calculus for your Honduran friend in the sense that if he stayed in Honduras, he was going to get killed as opposed to taking high risk of bodily and other types of harm and getting. I wonder about that equation. But my question is really for Pia in the first instance, and that has to do with comparisons between Central America and Mexico. There's been a high level of violence associated with drug cartels in Mexico as well as Central America. Has that problem been mitigated sufficiently in Mexico to explain part of the decline in Mexican immigration to the U.S.? And the other thing I would ask, it has to do with subsectoral aspects of the economic push from those countries. Has, for instance, the decline of the rural farm sector been accelerated in Central America compared with Mexico? Is Mexico getting better in that sense, that there's more economic factors pushing the groups from one country rather than the other? Just sort of get to a more refined level of analysis. I wonder if you would comment on that.
Sandy, a nice, simple question there. Who wants to start? Who wants to take a shot at it?
Well, I can say I think you've caught me and asked me about sort of where I have the weakest knowledge about the economies of Central America. I think that I know a little bit more about Mexico. I think in Mexico the violence was fairly concentrated and geographically, and so it wasn't widespread. And I also think that the research on the link between violence and migration in Mexico wasn't that clear, actually. We saw that some people actually would hunker down, and then of the ones that migrated, it was more the high-skilled migration, which was kind of interesting and new. So the situation in Mexico, and I think the violence has gotten better. I mean, I think the situation in Mexico has improved quite a bit. I think in Mexico you're dealing with more mature institutions and better governance, I think, in a lot of cases than in the Central American countries. And then also there's a demographic factor that Andrew mentioned. I mean, I think in Guatemala it's still, I think every woman is having like still 6 children. I mean, it really hasn't, the population growth is still rising in Guatemala, and I'm not sure if it's the same in Honduras and El Salvador. But I think that Mexico is just, in so many ways, both institutionally and economically, doing better than Central America. And I think they also have the ability, like Alfredo was pointing out, to actually respond to this recent crisis and actually crack down. So they can do things. They can mobilize resources. They are a rich economy. They have resources and they have good government structure, and they were able to mobilize resources and stop some of this children coming through.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Andrew?
Sure. I mean, in Mexico, ironically, after the rural economy really hollowed out in the 80s and 90s, and it's actually rebounded, oddly enough, although agriculture has not rebounded. But rural income has rebounded. And there's a couple reasons for it. I mean, and actually the Gini coefficient's gone down slightly in Mexico, in part because the rural economy is doing better. In fact, only about 18% of income in rural areas is farm income right now in Mexico. People is actually one's own farming one's own land in Mexico. People have become rural laborers. People have become artisans. 2 big things have been remittances, actually. And social policy, which is actually Progresa en Alcohol Oportunidades, this transfer program that gives people, about a quarter of Mexican families receive a government transfer for low-income families that gives them a base income, as long as they keep children in school and with regular medical checkups. And so we've actually seen a rebounding since in the early 2000s in the rural economy in Mexico. We're not seeing that in Central America. And I don't know the Central American numbers as well, but we aren't seeing that. Mexico has much more resilient, has much better institutions in that sense, has, as much as my Mexican friends and colleagues decry how deinstitutionalized Mexico is, and I know what they're talking about, at the same time, when you compare it, Mexico really has developed a set of institutions that have actually been able to deal with both public security as well as poverty challenges. Not perfectly, I mean, deeply imperfectly. I'm not a booster for, everything in Mexico is great. I mean, these are all imperfect institutions, but they are institutions, right? I mean, there's the beginning of things like that economic transfers, or improvements in the police that actually make a difference, and you can see that. And it's hard to see when you talk about Central America. I mean, there's sort of a scale of institutional capacity. There's a fair amount of it in El Salvador, less than in Mexico, but a fair amount. Guatemala is, in many ways, a captured state. We had the former Attorney General of Guatemala with us at the Wilson Center yesterday, Claudia Paz y Paz, about, the fact that, saying honestly, much of the police apparatus in Guatemala is captured by mafia groups, not all by drug traffickers, by various mafia groups. And then you get to Honduras. And Honduras has, perhaps the weakest institutions in the hemisphere other than Haiti. And so how you build on that is hard. How you build on that in rural areas, how you build on it for policing, it's a challenge.
I think this young lady over here, could you state your name and...
Good evening. My name is Luciana Milano. I'm a first year at the law school. I'm also from McAllen, Texas, and I'm very grateful that all of you are here today. My question is about foreign aid. One of the differences between Mexico, the U.S.-Mexico relationship, and that of toward Central American countries is the amount of aid that we've given Mexico in the last decade, and also the type of aid. So I was wondering if there's any policy discussions currently about either boosting foreign aid, whether it be military aid or economic aid, to Central America, and what role you think foreign aid has played in improving the situation in Mexico during the last decade. Thank you.
Who wants to take that one?
Andrew. I think most of what's happened in Mexico has been done by Mexicans. I think U.S. aid has been helpful around the margins. It's been important and helpful. It's helped lock some things in. It's helped empower people that were reformers who were trying to do the right thing. And what has probably helped more than anything else is intelligence cooperation between Mexico and the United States on tracking transnational crime groups, because we're really good at that. We have technology and the ability, particularly when groups cross international borders. That is something Jane Harman knows a great deal about. One of the great experts on intelligence. I mean, we really do have that in spades in a way that Mexico does not, although Mexico has begun to develop that capacity in notable ways in the past few years. With Central America, that relationship has been much less. And I think there's a huge opportunity to increase it. the challenge, you know, and this goes to Sandy's point from earlier, I mean, the challenge is there's different capabilities from the governments in being able to receive and use that aid, right? I mean, I will not say which country, but I mean, a vice president of one of the three countries in question in Central America were telling me at one point that when he wanted to have private conversations, he would not do it in the vice president's office because he was never sure who was listening. I mean, he was sure that the intelligence services of his country were listening, but wasn't sure who was actually getting the information, and so he would actually go for a walk with whoever he needed to talk to in the plaza outside of the presidential. This is the vice president of the country, okay? And he wasn't worried about being tapped by the president. He was worried about being tapped by other actors, you know, within the intelligence apparatus and the police forces and then the mafia groups in the country, right? And so how you can find, you know, that there's a different capacity to absorb outside assistance. And I think that's why Mexico and the United States working together may be better than the U.S. coming in. You know, we like to ride in on a white horse and get things done, but actually teaming up with Mexico, which has had its own challenges trying to build institutions, may actually be a much more realistic approach.
Ray, and then we'll go to the back. Ray Termini, and I think bring your microphone over here, Ray.
Andrew, I was fascinated by something you said about perhaps establishing centers in a country like Honduras where there's violence, and that countries like possibly Canada, Mexico, Costa Rica could come in and interview, as I understand it, people who want to leave the country. If I understood that correctly, that is what you said. How likely is that to happen? I mean, how willing is a country to say that we have fallen on our face and we cannot protect our own people? And what other countries can you think of where this could be used? Because it is an excellent idea. I'm just wondering how practical
It's something we've actually done in 2 or 3 cases before, and I wish I could tell you which ones they are. Diana Negroponte, who's at the Wilson Center, has actually done some research, and she has an article on this, looking at the other cases where we've set up. It's always been after major crises. It's always temporary. You can do it. You can't do it indefinitely, and no country, as you're right, would agree for you to. But what we've had in the past in countries in crisis is the government agreeing for us to come in for a couple of years and do this. And you do it at the embassy, right? I mean, you do a pre-screening. People come in and apply for a refugee visa, but you have to have personnel set up on the ground who can actually do the interviews and make some determinations ahead of time. The reason for bringing in other countries, and the Honduran government, this is actually, I mean, I think is being seriously considered. It's been in the, I don't think I'm giving away any secrets, it's been in the press reports. I mean, it is something the White House has looked at. Seriously, part of the desire of having other countries come in on this is, I think, probably political, which is, you know, it's certainly much more palatable to Congress if it's not just the U.S. doing this. But there's also a practical side, which is, you know, the sense that if you can sort of weed out people who just want to reunite with their families in the United States, because you don't know when you walk in if you're going to necessarily get the visa to the United States or if you're going to end up in Costa Rica. Now, if you're really fleeing for your life, ending up in Costa Rica is much better than where you are. Mm-hmm. If you're just trying to get reunited, you don't want that outcome. And so there's some thinking that would actually help separate out the people who are really in need. And there's some estimates that, you know, probably a third or to a half of the people, I don't know if anyone has really done a serious study on this, but just what policy people have told us, you know, a third to half of the people probably could qualify for refugee status. But, you know.
Alfredo, would you like to add anything to that?
Honduras, not from all of Central America.
Nope, okay.
What's your sense, Alfredo, how much violence is the motivating factor? I mean, you've talked to a lot of these kids.
I think, I think violence has been a factor for many, many years. What stunned me, what surprised me, is kind of something that Pia mentioned, was the guerrilla marketing geniuses, the smugglers. I mean, once we arrived in San Pedro Sula, we went out to the streets and started interviewing people, and right away people started asking us about amnesty, and. I mean, not just regular people, but people, NGOs, for example, the Comisión de Menonitas, de Actores Sociales. But I mean, these were people who are pretty intelligent. They're very on top of the news, but they were asking us how true was this whole amnesty thing. Mm-hmm. And then we started talking to community organizers in certain neighborhoods, and they all pointed out to the smugglers. Not just the smugglers, but also the the dynamic, the effect of social media. And it's interesting in Central America, you know, people talk about poverty and so forth, but it was interesting for us to see how many people actually have cell phones or some kind of mechanism to get the WhatsApp, for example, WhatsApp, Facebook. And you begin to understand how smugglers were very crafty and very savvy in spreading this idea, this notion that something was imminent. And that's I think what surprised me the most as far as the savvy marketing smugglers.
And Alfredo, could I follow up with you on that and just ask how effective do you think the U.S. government has been in deflecting this? You know, the Obama administration, getting the word out that look, just coming north doesn't mean that you're going to be able to get here and stay.
When we were there, they started the radio announcements. They started the TV campaign. But you know what? I'm still skeptical. I know the numbers are down from 10,000 to less than 4,000 as of last month. But when I talk to Central Americans in Mexico, which is something kind of funny because you talk to Central Americans in Mexico and say, look, we just want a chance. We want to do the jobs that Mexicans don't want to do. And I thought that was interesting. And many of them are staying in Mexico. Many of them are staying in places like Sonora, places like El Bajío in Querétaro, Guanajuato. I mean, they're trying to get temporary jobs before they decide whether or not to leave. But I'm skeptical because many of them will say to you, and also U.S. authorities will tell you, you know, yes, there is a fall, the numbers have fallen, but it is also the summertime. And and the weather is a huge factor. And then you talk to Central Americans themselves and they say, yes, we've heard the messages, we've seen the ads, but also we need you guys, the press, to lay off. Because all the media circus is just making it more difficult for us. So I think long term, I'm not so sure that the problem has been I think it's been managed for now. But getting back to Sandy's original point, I question what happens to these children or these young people when they go back, because there's not much, you know, to look forward to. And when you look at the MS-13, the MS-18, I mean, they were created in the United States. These are the gangs created in the United States and then spread like wildfire throughout Central America. What happens to people, young people, who are rejected twice? The first time by their home country, and then rejected by Mexico, and then rejected, and 3 times rejected by the United States.
Yeah, now we have a very special guest down here on the side. Nobody can see him. This is Ambassador Cross, I think, who is over here. You want to walk around, and Brandon, could you bring him a microphone? This gentleman's going to bring you a microphone, Ambassador.
Thank you, sir. As I think my colleagues, Andrew and Mr. Corchado, Alfredo, good friends, pointed out, I was ambassador to Honduras about 20 years ago, and I spent about 8 years of my career in the Foreign Service in Honduras, and then I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central America under Ronald Reagan, and had sorted jobs such as Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for International. So I've had experience with this. My point is, or my question is, I didn't hear what we're going to do with the 112 million.
Yep.
And this is a tough one.
Yeah.
I realize.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
And Andrew may remember several years ago, I was at Georgetown, and somebody was talking about immigration and all that. And I said, I think that here in America, we may have a mistaken view of Latin immigration. We didn't come through the Statue of Liberty. We didn't come through Ellis Island. We were conquered because of a war with Mexico or Spain.
Yeah.
So
yep.
And the issue is when you hear no amnesty.
Yep.
In this state, you hear it very loudly. Yet we have amnesty for the Cubans. Where they come legally or illegally. And so we contradict ourselves in many ways.
Yeah. Well.
So the issue is, how do we deal with
Yeah. I've always asked myself, how do you say in Spanish the elephant in the room? Is there a Spanish word for the elephant in the room? But that is obviously the huge policy question. I doubt if we're going to be able to resolve it here in this panel, but would anyone like to offer some words of wisdom about how to deal with the large unauthorized population that is here in the United States? We've got a couple more minutes, yeah.
I guess one of the most likely outcomes, if anything happens, is that something like the DACA provision will be extended to other unauthorized immigrants. And so it's not really legal status. It's not obviously permanent residence or citizenship. But it would be, you know, you wouldn't be subject to deportation, and you would get a work permit, and then you end up in some kind of temporary status, and that would get renewed over time. And lots of Central Americans have this status similar to that, the TPS, the temporary protective status. And so many from El Salvador, for example, have that status, and it gets renewed. Of course, there's no transition from TPS to green card to citizenship. So, I mean, I think surveying the lay of the land at the moment, I would see something like that would be the most likely.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question, and then we're going to, or two more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. I've got permission for two more questions. So, Stephen Hammond, who's in the back here, could you bring him a microphone, please? I don't know if those microphones are working. Have you got them on? Speak into the microphone. There you go. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Selee, you mentioned we're moving toward a new paradigm, and I've been wondering for a couple of decades now about the elephant in the room. We're talking about how to accommodate these 12 million people, and it seemed like the new paradigm is moving toward some accommodation for those 12 million people. And I've noticed that those 12 million people are largely Hispanic or Latino. And I'm wondering, if we're going to accommodate those 12 million people, can we accommodate 12 million Kenyans and Somalians and Chinese and Russians and Germans and Canadians? And like, why are we talking about only accommodating Hispanic Latino people?
Anybody want to take a quick shot at that? Andrew?
Oh, sure. Since I think there are a number of playouts on this. About 80% of the people in that number, if I'm not mistaken, Pia, you probably know the right number, are from Latin America. There's a substantial number from other countries, including, oddly enough, Canada and Europe, Asia, Africa, a number of other places around the world. I mean, people come from all over. But the largest number, because of the past 25 years, we assume all of us here have either grown up with in the last 25 years or spent the last 25 years looking at this issue at a time when Mexican immigration, and to a lesser extent from other parts of Latin America, but really overwhelmingly Mexican immigration and unauthorized immigration, was a big piece of the immigration flow. That's actually unusual when you look back at American history. I think we're going to look back and realize that this was actually an unusual period. They're all unusual periods. I mean, there was a time when there was huge, Eastern European immigration. There was a time when there was, there was a large Japanese immigration. There are periods that we've gone through. All of them are unusual periods. And we just happen to live through the most recent unusual period. So the debate right now, when we talk about the 11 million, is about 80% of those people are from Latin America, and probably 55% are from Mexico, give or take. But, this is, again, an unusual period. I think Pia's play out is the most likely, that we're going to see some sort of TPS, some sort of administrative action. There is actually an easy majority in Congress to do something about immigration reform. I mean, you can actually lock people in a room. I know Jane would love to do this on many issues, lock her own colleagues in a room and get them to hammer out something and not come out until they actually agreed on things, because they really do agree on things if they don't get in front of the cameras. They would actually agree on the broad outlines of immigration reform, doing something about our visa system, doing something about the 11 million that would be some sort of earned legalization, and doing something about enforcement, and they could probably reach some agreement. But in the charged, polarized environment, it isn't clear exactly what we're going to have happen. My guess is we're probably not going to get a path to citizenship, but my guess is you'll probably get some administrative action. Jane, why don't you?
By 2017, we will no longer be a majority white country. We'll be a majority minority country. Majority something else country. And I think the politics on this are going to change.
Yep.
I personally think they should change. Comprehensive immigration bill did not pass in Congress. But at any rate, I think by then it will occur that they want to have Latino support in their campaign.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
that will move them toward fixing
Mhm.
this problem. It is not the only immigration problem we
Yep.
have. But I do think that then, that's
Mhm.
not so many years from now.
Yep.
That's actually within 5 years, the politics may change.
And I know you represented California, and here we're sitting in Texas, and you know there's a big argument. Which is Texas going to look more like California, or California more like Texas?
I was very upset when Richard said that Californians are coming to Texas. Los Angeles, which I did represent, is the second largest Mexican city in the world.
Yep. Los Angeles, the second largest Mexican city in the world. Ed Retta, I think you're going to get the last question. And could you bring the microphone over here for Mr. Retta? And then we're going to have some time for you to interact with the panelists afterwards. So don't run away. Yes.
Thank you.
Ed.
Hi, my name is Edward Retta. My father was an unaccompanied minor, hitchhiked here from Monterrey, Mexico. I've been lobbying in Washington, D.C. for the last 5 years for comprehensive immigration reform. Simple question. And I appreciate the Tower Center and you all doing this because the rhetoric out there is absurd, as I think we all know. We've heard a lot of explanations, but the question that I have not heard answered well is this, is what are the factors, statistically, not opinions, not political spin, that have contributed to the surge of these Central American children?
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a version out there that it is, in fact, Obama administration policies that have spurred this, and the entrepreneurial smugglers of the myth of some kind of permiso or amnistía or something. So we know that overall crime rates have only gone up in Honduras from your statistics. We know that the economies have been stable. So what do we know from social science or other research that actually explains the upward surge of the Central American immigrants that hit the news in May and June? Sadly, the media has not accurately or adequately addressed this. Thank you.
So, Ed, you put the social scientists on the spot. I think I'm going to call on Alfredo Corchado, who is a journalist who probably knows more about what's happening on the ground. Alfredo, how do we answer that question?
I mean, that was really the question we were trying to answer when we went to Honduras. And I think all those factors played. I mean, the poverty, the violence. Poverty's always been there. Right, the poverty. But you know, there is a number. There's a number that that we looked at that was really interesting. And this is June of 2000, during the presidential election campaign. I think it was 2012. When President Obama announces that there won't be any deportations for children, the numbers that fall began to climb incredibly, and that's something that when you talk to Central Americans, you talk to people in Honduras, they cite that speech.
For the students in the room, that's called a moral hazard.
Right, and then that's, I mean, you start seeing the numbers, and I talked to some experts at the University of Texas at El Paso. When they were interviewing people along the border, and suddenly they were talking to Border Patrol agents who were saying, we're just not, it's not about apprehending anymore, but it's about going to the local grocery store to buy milk and buy things for all these children that are coming all of a sudden. I don't know, I mean, I think that was one huge factor.
Andrew, Pia, would you like to add anything? Andrew? Or Pia?
I think that, yeah, I mean, we don't know yet. I mean, obviously the research hasn't been done yet. It's just happening and going on at the moment, so it's still hard to get the data, actually, and to do a proper study. But, I mean, I think what I was trying to put up with some suggestions. I mean, I was sort of suggesting that policy has something to do with it, and these entrepreneurial smugglers have something to do with it, and it's just... You have to remember, you don't see the same increase among Mexican minors, because if Mexican minors cross, they are readily deported, and so they don't get reunited with family members. They don't get court dates that are years out, and so I mean you have to conclude then that there's the unique situation of these third countries. They actually can stay for at least a period of time.
Again, one social science lesson of the day is there's rarely a single causal factor. Andrew, would you like to conclude?
And I'd like, by the way, that was a congressional decision for humanitarian reasons. It was very much bipartisan for humanitarian reasons to not deport people, to give people due process. on the consent calendar. Yeah. It was very popular, right? I mean, again, moral hazard, right? It was something that was designed really to take care of young people who might be, you know, trafficked, which is a major concern. I'd want to do due process with these kids to make sure there was no trafficking. Who doesn't? Yeah, it was a very popular thing to do, and you know, the unintended consequences. Yeah. I think the one country, I think you have a slightly different dynamic in Honduras than you do anywhere else, which is when you map the violence and you map where people are leaving, there really is a huge coincidence. It's hard to tell that's causality, but there's a huge coincidence. And Hondurans are the largest number, Honduran young people are the largest increase percentage-wise. They also have the least history of migration to the U.S. There's been a much longer Salvadoran migration and to some extent Guatemalan. Honduras is a much newer migration, and it really has shot up among young people. So I think there's some reason to believe, particularly in Honduras, that the violence is a major causal factor. Hard to tell where you put it in the ranking, but it is a major causal factor. And in El Salvador, violence had been going down for a while. El Salvador was actually the most violent country for a while. It went down. Honduras replaced it. But there was actually a gang truce that fell apart in the spring. And so there's some reason to believe in El Salvador, at least in May and June, I think it fell apart at the end of April, that there may be a bit of an increase because of that as well. And we just have to see what happens. And in El Salvador, it's a little more fluid right now.
Okay, I want to first of all thank Jane Harmon and the Woodrow Wilson Center for helping bring this program here to Dallas. Let's give them a hand. I also want a hearty round of applause for our panelists, and do take some time to chat with them afterwards. Let's give them a hand.